See me, and I also hope you can hear me. My name is Frank Griffel. I'm professor of Islamic Studies here at Yale, currently also the chair of the Department of Religious Studies. It's my great honor today to host a CMS colloquium talk with my colleague Robyn Creswell from the Comparative Literature Department. Robyn Creswell joined Yale in 2014. Before that, he was assistant professor of comparative literature at Brown University. And before that, he got his PhD in 2012 from NYU, where he worked, among other things, with Philip Kennedy, Richard Seaborth, and others. In the years 2010 and 2018, he was also the poetry editor of the Paris Review, a modernist literary magazine. And I'm today here to talk with him about a recent book that he has published, City of Beginnings, Modern Poetry, Poetic Modernism in Beirut. I hold it up and hope you can see it. It's a fascinating book, I must say, in terms of the research it produces, but also in terms of the story it tells and the way it tells the story. I want to start our discussion with reading out the first sentence in the book. Arabic modernism was a literary movement of exiles and immigrants who planted their flag in West Beirut during the mid-1950s, when the Lebanese capital became a meeting ground for intellectuals from across the region. The sentence sets up the stage for the book. It's about a city, Beirut, in the 1950s and in the 1960s. Our poster, for instance, showed the Phoenicia Intercontinental Hotel, which was opened in 1961, one of the, you would say, major monuments of modernist architecture in Beirut, which was destroyed during the war, during the civil war in 1977 and 78, and currently again suffered from the terrible destruction that happened in Beirut in August of this year due to the explosion close by at the harbor. Beirut in the 1950s and 60s is the stage, and I would like to ask Robyn Creswell to start talking about the role that Beirut played in those days and why the story of modernist poetry is set in Beirut.
Well, thank you, Frank. And thank you for everybody else for coming. I'm looking forward to this. It's a pleasure to talk with Frank, who knows so much about this material. And yes, Beirut is the stage for this book for a number of reasons. And it really, one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book in the first place was to explain in some way the relationship between the modernist poetry being written by Adonis and Yusuf al-Khal and Unsi al-Hajj and others, which is really, I think, to my mind and to a lot of people's minds, the most important artistic movement in the Middle East since World War II. But I always had the feeling that the relationship between Beirut and the movement had not been particularly well explained. And one of the curious things about the poetry written by these poets, and we're talking about the 1950s, 1960s, and up until the beginning of the Lebanese Civil War in 1975, that it actually, not much of it has to do with Beirut. There's a kind of turning away from the city itself, which is curious, especially if one knows something about modernist poetry, when so much of it, from the Wasteland to Hart Crane to Baudelaire, I mean, the canonical examples have so much to do with life in the city. Whereas Beirut in the poetry doesn't often figure, actually. It's often a poetry of the sea and the Mediterranean for interesting reasons, which we could get into later. But so this contextualization was interesting to me. And basically the argument that I make is that Beirut had a really anomalous, very interesting and anomalous position within the Arab world's intellectual landscape. And this is a moment after World War II when a lot of states, following the Egyptian example in particular, following the Nasserist example, were building the state and swelling the state to an enormous degree. So the Nasserist regime in Egypt, various different regimes in Syria and Damascus, and also the Ba'athist regimes in Syria and also in Iraq during this period. And one of the things that they did were to mobilize or else censor local intellectuals. And because these states suddenly built up their capacity to really, I mean, if you look at the sort of statistics for how many state employees there were in Egypt, Syria, and Iraq during this period, it's an absolute explosion of the state. You know, tripling and quadrupling the numbers of state employees. And some of these were security apparatus, some of these were censorship apparatus, some of these were, you know, obviously just the usual civil engineers and such. But it also meant that there was a certain kind of mobilization and hegemony, let's say, put on intellectuals in all of these states. And so for some, there was an impulse to flee. Exile. This was exacerbated, of course, in the Palestinian instance by the fact of 1948, when many Palestinian intellectuals fled north. And so Beirut became this hub for intellectual life, really, during the 1950s and 60s, because it had a relatively weak state. France, as the imperial power in Lebanon, kept, you know, it ran Lebanon basically on a shoestring budget, and it subcontracted the work of imperialism to the various sectarian communities within Lebanon, the Maronites, the Shias, the Sunnis, the Armenians. And so the state was very self-consciously and determinedly kept small and weak. But this had the advantage of there being relatively low censorship apparatus. And also Lebanon has for a very long time had the status of being the great publisher within the Arab world. The old cliche goes that they write books in Egypt, they publish them in Lebanon, and they read them in Iraq. Actually, sometimes I forget whether or not they read them in Egypt or they read them in Baghdad. But in any case, Lebanon is always the place where they're published, and this has been true. This part of the cliche is true, that the Lebanese publishing industry has been very well evolved, has been highly sophisticated for a very long time and polyglot. And so Beirut really served as this kind of clearinghouse and a refuge for intellectuals from all over the Arab world. And most of the intellectuals that I talk about, in fact, were not Lebanese. Adonis, who's at the center of my book, is a Syrian and who fled after a year in prison for his political militancy in 1955. He fled to Beirut, and he was very much a representative example of Arab intellectuals during this period, many of whom just fled to Beirut. And so it became this effervescent place for intellectuals, and especially intellectuals who were seeking to elaborate intellectual projects that were outside the purview of the various state governments in the region.
Yeah, thanks very much. You also say that the book is situated at the crossroads of poetry critics and intellectual history. And for many of us, poetry critics is something, in this case, that is very difficult to follow. We know something about Arabic poetry, but we also realize that there's so much more for us that we do not know. I would like to talk a little bit in this case, what's so significant about modernist poetry? What's the difference that modernist poetry actually brings into what many of us, or some of us know in this case from our training, in this case from the classical Arabic qasida, right? And why this is so significant that it actually creates a movement.
Right. And I would say, it's an old sort of hobby horse of mine, but I would say that especially in the Arab world during this period, a kind of conflation of the public intellectual, the role of the public intellectual and that of the poet, is a very important and common one. That is to say, those intellectuals who really elaborated a response, a literary response to the various political and historical crises of the region. And one can tell the story of the Middle East during the post-war period as a series of crises, whether it be 1948 or 1967. I mean, there are various coups in various places between those two events, but then the war in 1973. Anyway, I think it is a kind of succession of crises, and the poets have been really, I think, the most important spokespeople for the response to those crises. They have elaborated kind of, the grievances, the celebrations, the critiques of those in power. And so poets have actually been, in a way that I think we find somewhat hard to imagine as Americans or Europeans, they have been it's both a populist art or a popular art, as well as the most important of all the Arab literary arts, because it has a pedigree, as you say, Frank, that goes back to the pre-Islamic period, in fact. I mean, the oldest text that we have in Arabic, basically, are poems.
Right.
So the art has this foundational status, but it also has a popular legitimacy, I think. So poets have been public intellectuals. The difference with the modernist poets, I would say, is that, and this is a tricky part of the story that I'm trying to tell, is that they were, at times at least, some of them self-consciously hermetic in their procedures. They wrote poetry that was supposed to be difficult. I mean, this is something that makes it modernist poetry, or recognizable as modernist poetry, is that they were very determined to write poetry that would be not easy to read the first time around. So it's highly elusive, as the Wasteland is. And the Wasteland was a very important poem for a lot of them in the Middle East. So they wrote poetry that was very experimental. I mean, it was they would say avant-garde. I think that's not quite the right phrase to use for what they were doing, but they wrote poetry that was difficult because they were imitating poetry that was taken difficult, and they wrote poetry that was that broke certain kinds of strictures. The most famous of these strictures in Arabic poetry, there's a tradition that goes back some 1400 years, basically, of using a series of classical meters to write a poem. And in some ways, that's what makes a poem, is that it uses these meters. In the 1940s and 50s, certain Iraqi poets, instead of using a kind of hemistichal or amudi or columnar form of poetry, started using so that each verse would have the same number of, let's say, metrical feet per line. So it would be every single line of a 100-line poem would have, say, 6 metrical feet, translating loosely. They started writing poetry that would be in metrical feet, but which would have 1 foot, 3 feet, 5 feet, 2 feet, like that. And this itself was a huge revolution, let's say. The modernist poets that I'm talking about went one further and set one step further and said you can actually write poems in prose. So one of their many translational projects or poetic imports was that of the poem en prose, mostly from the French. We can talk about the details, but mostly from the French rather than the English tradition. And so one of the debates that swirls around these poets and makes them so important and controversial is whether or not they're actually writing Arabic poetry at all.
Right. And I'd like to move on and talk about the ideological commitments of the people who are part of this movement. There is a sentence in your introduction where you say, as is often the case with liberal art, the ideological content of Arabic modernist poems is most present where it is most strongly denied. Maybe you can explain what you mean here.
So one of the things that I try to do in treating the poets as intellectuals is to sketch a kind of landscape, an intellectual landscape, which goes beyond the Arab world, in fact, in which I'm trying to look at, I'm situating modernism in this period. I call it late modernism, but it's the modernism of the post-war period. It's not the modernism of the Vorticists and the symbolists and the Dadaists. It's not the modernisms of the early part of the 20th century, most of whom did not consider themselves modernist, I would argue. Eliot and Pound and Apollinaire and Ungaretti or Lorca, they, for the most part, this rhetoric of modernism was not one that they used. They used lots of other isms, but like Vorticism or symbolism or what have you. But modernism was not one of them. And so one of my arguments is that modernism really gets recognized and such and given a determinate ideology, literary ideology, really happens in the post-war period. And that ideology is, I say, one of autonomy, of artistic, and in particular, in this case, poetic autonomy, so that the poem can kind of stand aside from, stand above or beyond its political and historical conditions. And this was, of course, again, in the Lebanese context, a very antagonistic way of thinking about poetry, because they were surrounded in Egypt, in Syria, and in Iraq by poets who were very engagés. They were, in many cases, Marxist or nationalist intellectuals. They were mobilizing on behalf of newly independent or soon to be independent states. And so the idea that poetry could turn away from historical circumstances and not be engagé, this was part of what they meant by being modernist. And that's why I call it a liberal ideology, because I think in this period, one of the things that liberalism means is to say that we're beyond the political. We're engaged in kind of maybe technocratic or professionalist political aspirations, but we're not actually. But really, culture. A tenet of liberalism during this period is that culture has nothing to do with politics. You can have a free realm of culture that floats above its political and historical conditions. So I mean, I could say more about that, but that is very definitely the way that the modernist poets in Lebanon and Beirut think about the relationships between state and political culture and artistic culture. That is to say, there is no relation, and right. Poetry should float above its conditions.
And since you mentioned it, of course, the post-war period is also the period of the Cold War. And one of the ironies of the movement, the way you portray it in the book, is that on the one hand, it understands itself as apolitical. On the other hand, it was deeply involved in political context. And at one point, you talk about the influence of the Congress of Cultural Freedom, which is an American organization, and maybe you can explain that a little bit.
Yes, this was kind of the archival portion of my book. This notion that poetry and culture more generally, or art more generally, can float above political polemics and activity was roundly rejected by poets all over the region, who said that this was basically a mask, that this was an illusion, and it was that really behind this mask there was a definite Cold War ideology, and it was one of liberal capitalism. This was a very common polemical strategy by the movements, made by the movement's enemies. And they had a lot of enemies. In fact, and at various points, their magazines and writings were actually banned in countries surrounding Lebanon. So this ideological kind of liberalism had a institutional infrastructure, let's say, during the post-war period, which was that of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Now, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, for those who don't remember the controversies that arose around it in the late 50s and early 60s, this was a group that held conferences and published lots and lots of magazines all over the world. The most significant of these magazines was Encounter in Britain, which Frank Kermode actually edited at the end of its life, at the beginning of his own career. Stephen Spender also had a hand in that, but it published Preuve in France, it published Der Monat in Berlin, it published magazines in Tokyo, and for a while they wanted to. Well, before it was revealed in the late 1960s that the Congress for Cultural Freedom was actually a front group for the CIA. So basically, the Congress was kind of the cultural arm of the Marshall Project. Its stated goal was basically to woo left-wing and liberal intellectuals away from communism. and the center of its activities was in Europe, but it had a global presence. And this idea of kind of culture as floating above its historical political circumstances is right at the center of what its ideology is. And it's arguing against the Soviet Union. It's saying, look, state culture is what the Soviets do. It's what the communists do. This is not state culture. This is culture as space for freedom from intellectual exchange and all this kind of thing. So they had a Congress. There was a very famous Congress in 1961 that was held in Rome, to which all of the poets that I'm talking about in my book came. I'll show you a little picture of it. I could. Yeah. This is actually that hotel you're talking about, the Phoenicia Hotel, which is kind of it's a modernist hotel. It was built in 1961. But here's the Rome conference. This is Adonis, a young Adonis. This is a man named Ibrahim, who was also associated with the modernist movement. He was a Palestinian intellectual. He translated Faulkner and Shakespeare. He's a very important cultural mediator. This is the editor-in-chief of the Modernist magazine that I look at in the book. His name is Yusuf Al-Khaw. And this is a man named Tawfiq Sayer, who ended up, in fact, editing the magazine that the Congress for Cultural Freedom did ultimately set up in Beirut in 1963. One of the things that my book discovers, I guess, or at least confirms, is that there was no actual concrete relationship after this conference between the Arab poets and the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the CIA front group. Which was a kind of accusation that was made against these poets for a very long time. It turns out not to be true, although for interesting reasons. I mean, the poets really wanted it to happen. In fact, they wanted to be a part of this. They didn't know that it was a CIA front group, but they wanted to be part of this, this Congress and its global reach. I mean, the attractions of belonging to this kind of network of magazines were huge, because if you published in one, you could also publish in 3 others at the same time. It was really global modernism, and it's an amazing archive to look at the ways in which a Faulkner essay or Ralph Ellison essay could be published in Encounter, but also at the very same time, because of the way that it was the infrastructure for the Congress was set up. It could also be published in Beirut and Tokyo and Australia. So it was it was the first version of a really global modernist project, and a certain notion of like world literature. And they wanted to glom on to this. Ultimately, the American CIA, the case officers, decided that these modernists they didn't have enough street cred, basically. They didn't have enough cultural bona fides. They were a little too weird to be useful, frankly. They didn't exactly want hermetic poetry. They wanted modernism, but they didn't want hermetic poetry. They wanted a modernism of a more popular and frankly nationalist, anti-communist but nationalist variety. Whereas these poets were, they were really committed internationalists, and they weren't a popular group. They didn't want to be.
I'm going to ask you a question in this case about the relationship to the literary heritage. But before I do that, I also want to remind our audience that we're going to open up for questions soon. Questions are to be put into the Q&A section of your Zoom program, and you can already start thinking about it. You can also send us questions. We'd be interested in your questions, and Robyn will be happy to answer them. Talking about the relationship to the literary heritage, there are two Arabic words that you mentioned also in the introduction. In this case, one is something that plays an important role in my field in Islamic theology. That's ta'wil. It's kind of goes back in this case, of course, to the root of awwala, going back to the beginnings. And then there is another word that also plays an important role, naql. And maybe you can clarify what, for instance, Adonis means when he actually uses a word like ta'wil.
Yeah, so ta'wil is often just used as a kind of word for exegetical interpretation. So the interpretation of passages in the Quran that are especially ambiguous, that require interpretation in a particularly an exacerbated kind of fashion. So But certain strands of exegetical thought have made it somewhat a narrower word, which means something like allegorical interpretation, an almost symbolist interpretation. And it, as you say, what the word technically means is to bring something back to its origin, to bring an interpretation back to its origin. Naql, on the other hand, means some sort of transport, and it can be used as a synonym for translation. And part of what I'm arguing in the book is that really the importance of this group in Beirut was its work of translation, that they were very, very important translators. This can be seen in the magazine that they published. The magazine is called Sha'r. It was published between 1956 and 1970. It was a quarterly. And they had large sections of the magazine were set aside each issue for the translation of foreign poetry, whether it be French, English, American, Spanish, Italian. They translated an enormous amount of verse, from mostly modern verse. Whitman, Hart Crane, Baudelaire, Ungaretti, Saint-Jean-Perse, Apollinaire, Yeats. Anyway, the greats of European modernism, and they translated it systematically, I would say, and in interesting ways. And that was part of why they were so important, was this just infusion of foreign poetries and poetics into the Arabic, with quite dramatic consequences, I would say. But the other kind of translation that they did, I describe as actually a kind of ta'wil, an interpretation of original or ancient texts, and a repurposing of them for contemporary conditions. So one of the things that was very, very interesting to me is, okay, if this is your idea of what modernist poetry is, that is to say, it's internationalist and it's also in some sense apolitical. Like, what kind of relationship to the past does that suggest, to the poetic past? And one of the things that Adonis writes about in a very interesting anthology of poetry that he published in the late 1960s, which basically is his version of the Arabic poetic canon, stretching from the pre-Islamic period up to the present. And he says, well, this is a radical kind of reorientation of this canon. And one of the things that I'm doing is I'm excluding all poems of praise and blame, medh and hijat. These are the two absolutely central canonical genres of classical poetry: praise for a patron, for a ruler, for whomever, and blame of another ruler or a tribe or somebody who has insulted you. I mean, these are by far the largest genres of poetry. So to say that I'm going to get rid of them, it truly is a radical kind of rereading. And why does he do that? Is because he says very specifically, these are political poems, talking about 8th century poems, 10th century poems, 13th century poems. I'm going to get rid of all these praise poems and poems of vituperation or blame or satire. I'm going to get rid of them because they're merely political. They're not poetic enough. And instead, what he actually focuses on, very interestingly to my mind, is the genre of elegy, which he sees as being a particularly personal, individualist kind of a discourse of the emotions. And in that way, it can be explained as an apolitical kind of genre. And it's in some ways, it's a surprisingly, I think, effective, moving reorientation and revision of the classical canon, so that it becomes full of elegies, and you really do see it in a very, very different way. So that's one way of talking about their relationship to the classical poetic heritage.
So what you bring up there is the internationalism of the movement. And from there, I want to move on a little bit towards geography. So one of the poems that is translated is Ezra Pound's first canto, which starts with a line, "And then we went down to the ships," which is translated by Yusuf al-Khal and then also published in Sha'r. That brings up this interesting relationship towards the sea, towards maritime metaphors that you talk about. Maybe you can enlighten us a little bit in this case about the role of the port, the place in this case where the land actually crosses into the sea. But at the same time, also, you point out in this case, there is a vision about harbor, about ports, but there seems to be a disinterest in the city.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, I think that this, as I said at the beginning, actually, this is one of the things that's very surprising, I think, to me and to anybody who studies modernist poetry of the kind of sanctified variety, that is to say, the European and American kind, which has everything to do with city life. It has to do with fast cars, it has to do with electrification, it has to do with the anonymity of being in the crowd, all of these kinds of very definite phenomenon of urban living, which is basically absent from the Beiruti modernist poetry. There are a few examples, but what one is struck by is instead, I think, the number of poems that have to do with the sea. And so, for instance, I was saying that they translate this canon of European poetry in a very particular manner, and you see that the poems that they're actually interested in, the European poems that they're actually interested in, again and again have to do with topoi of seafaring. So Saint-Jean-Perse has a poem. Saint-Jean-Perse was a poet of the mid-century who was incredibly important, probably after T.S. Eliot, the most famous poet in the world at the time, and wrote a poem called Amer, which usually translated as sea marks. But of Yeats, they were particularly interested in sailing to Byzantium, and so the types of poem that they were interested in were seafaring poems. So, and this, I should just explain one thing further, is that this kind of cultural vision of turning away from the interior towards the sea had a kind of political valence, which is to say, that's the past. The past belongs to the desert, it belongs to the interior, it's kind of this decrepit past. And what we're turning towards is this new future, the nouveau that, comes up in Baudelaire's poems of seafaring too. So they're turning towards the Mediterranean as this place of kind of openness and exchange and cultural give and trade. So it sets off from the harbor. And so I talk about the Ezra Pound translation. I should say Ezra Pound's, the first canto of the cantos is actually a translation itself, not just a translation of the trip to the underworld in Homer, but a translation of the Latin translation of Homer. So the Arabic text is actually a translation of Pound, of a translation of a Latin text of a translation. So that is to say that translation was a really big deal for them. They were emphasizing it from the beginning, and not only translation, but this vision of the sea as kind of going down into a Mediterranean cultural heritage that was very definitely and polemically and antagonistically a turn away from the interior and what they thought of as this sclerotic and no longer useful classical heritage that that needed, if it could be used, it had to be really deeply and radically revised.
I'm going to have one more question, and then I open up to the Q&A. We already have a couple of questions here, and that's particularly the question about the hinterland. It's clear in this case, when you sit in Beirut, you look out into the Mediterranean, that's your kind of internationalism. But there was also another, we talked about the political context earlier, but there was another political context in the sense that many of these, of the people who were involved in the movement were interested in one particular political party, the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, the SSNP, which was founded by Antoun Saadeh. What's the relationship to that?
This is another part of the context that I do feel like has been kind of badly explained by previous scholars of this movement, and it has had some very good ones. But everybody knows, biographically speaking, that the poets who turned out to be modernists in the late 50s and throughout the 60s, had basically all of them belonged earlier in the 1940s and the early 50s to this party, which is called the SSNP. Sometimes it's called the Parti Populaire Syrien, PPS, the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. And this was a party that was founded in the 1930s by a guy named Antoun Saadeh. He was a Greek Orthodox Lebanese man. an incredible orator by all accounts, and a very charismatic kind of politician. And his idea was one of what's called greater Syrian nationalism. That is to say that there is a geographical and human community centered in basically the states bounded by Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, possibly even Cyprus. That this is a historical and geographical entity. And it was a party that was very, it was welcomed by a lot of minoritarian groups in that region. So if you are not particularly enthralled by the project of Arab nationalism, and this is the moment of Nasserist Arab nationalism, which a lot of these minority groups viewed as a kind of disguised form of Sunni nationalism. And you are also in this region, especially in Lebanon, not particularly interested in the narrow Lebanese version of nationalism, which is basically Maronite Lebanese nationalism. Then this Parti Populaire Syrien kind of struck a balance between the two. And in fact, it did attract intellectuals who were Druzes, Shia, disaffected Maronites, so Armenians, so groups that, and Greek Orthodox, so groups that didn't find a home in any of the various other nationalist projects. And it did have a kind of a mass following, but it was especially important to intellectuals in the region. So all of the poets that I'm talking about, from Adonis to Unsi al-Hajj to Yusuf al-Khal, all belong to this party. Now, the antagonists of the modernist movement sometimes implied that modernism itself was just a kind of disguised version of the PPS, of the SSNP. I think that that's wrong. I think that the story that really needs to be told is how they kind of fell out of love with nationalist politics of that sort, and translated some of its terms into a modernist aesthetic. So one of the things that I do talk about is that Saada himself, as a Syrian nationalist, actually wrote a lot of cultural tracts. And one of them describes the importance of using Syrian myths, myths of Adonis, for example, to establish a national literature. But the purpose of establishing this national literature was to kind of open up Syrian literature to wider, what he called world literature. This is in the 1930s and 1940s. He called it world literature. And so I talk about how that vision of, delving down into the native heritage, a nationalist native heritage, as Adonis was, or as Saada was conceiving it, was actually a way of opening up to the wider world and the notion of world literature. I think that ambition of the party carried over into the modernist vision, which was an apolitical vision, though, differently from the original one, which was very determinately a nationalist one, a political one. So that's the story that I tried to tell, how they went from belonging and being militants in a nationalist political movement, which is a very interesting one and probably understudied, frankly, and not well understood in this country, because it's a very, very important political party, how they went from that experience to becoming modernist aesthetes of a particular post-war variety that we can recognize.
Right. So I'm opening up the floor now for Q&As. Keep them coming in. We already have some. The first one comes from Mohammed Aziz, who's senior lecturer of Arabic in the NELC department. He asks, were the poets of Beirut in connection with other poets from the Arab world? Are there any examples?
Well, they were often in touch with them in a polemical context. So yes, the poets who are generally thought of as multazimin, that is to say, engagé poets, they engaged in various fights, let's say, polemics, in the pages of the magazine. And they tried in some cases, interestingly, to woo them into their own modernist movement. The most interesting and intricate and very subtle episode in that history, I think, is when the poet Bedr Shakar Sayyab, who was probably the most important, interesting Iraqi poet of this period, who wrote a poem called Unshurat al-Matar, which is viewed as probably maybe the most important hymn to rain or canticle of rain poem of the period. He was quite politically politics was a kind of trauma to him. He started out as a communist. He kind of fell into an Arab nationalist or Arab nationalist camp, but was at various points attracted by the Beiruti poets' vision of culture and poetry that did not serve determinate political ends. I think just exhausted by the kind of infighting that went on in Iraqi political and poetic circles, he went to this Congress that I mentioned. He was actually one of the guests, and he read a paper about iltizam, that is to say, engagé poetry. And for a very brief period, he seemed to be becoming almost one of the members of this modernist movement. So, and they wanted to be, I mean, they did not want to be, they didn't want to be exactly isolated. I mean, they had a determinate position. They were not going to become nationalists, the modernists. They were not going to become Marxists. They were anti-Marxist, frankly. But they didn't want to be just kind of secluded in Beirut. They wanted to have allies outside of the region. They wanted to have readers outside the region. They wanted to teach those readers how to read poetry differently. And that would take some doing. They were intransigent in a certain sense, in the sense that they wanted to write poetry that was not going to be understood the first time around, but it was a systematic project. I mean, that's one of the things that I really, frankly impressed by, that they had a very, very systematic project of translating the classical past, of translating European poetry, and of changing Arabic poetry in such a way that it was, it would be Arabic poetry, but it'd be a very, very different kind of poetry from the one that had gone before it. And they did this in a really systematic fashion for about 15 years. And so they did at various points try to, I would say, engage other poets. But and I would say, really, their importance has to do with the posterity. I mean, actually the Qasidat al-Nathr, which is the prose poem, which was so vilified actually at the time that they proposed it and started writing them in the early 1960s. That this has gone on to be basically a kind of standard way of writing poems in Arabic. At the time that it was pioneered, it was very, very controversial, not only for poetic but political reasons. And yet now, I really would say it's kind of become a poetic standard.
The next question comes from Peter Cole, who's your colleague in the Comparative Literature Department. A follow-up question to something you said in relation to naql and the dramatic results or effects on Arabic of importing the foreign. Could you say more about what some of those dramatic effects were?
Well, yeah. So I think the most dramatic effect did have to do with meter, and I'll put it in this context. A lot of questions about meter have to do with music, actually. And in Arabic, the word would be tarab, meaning some kind of musical ecstasy. And for a long time, including in the classical period, it's been stipulated that poetry, like music, aims at producing a certain kind of tarab in the audience. So it's a traditional kind of musical affect in that sense. Ibn al-Rashiq, for instance, says very clearly, right, poetry is supposed to induce tarab, and it does so through its use of Arab meters. And the great mutribin, that is to say, singers of the period in the 40s and 50s and up into the 60s, were the most kind of popular musicians in the Arab world, like Kulthum, Abdelhalim. the modernist said basically, we're talking about an entirely different kind of music. Our music has nothing to do with meter, and it has nothing to do with tarab, because meter is they associated it with kind of the metronome and mechanism, that kind of as far as they were concerned, outdated, decrepit kind of poetry, which also had this rapturous relationship, and a bad rapturous relationship with its audience, which they did not want. They wanted a different kind of relationship with its audience. They wanted what you could say is kind of a writerly relationship to its audience, rather than an oral relationship with its audience. Like that whole tradition, which is incredibly important, we're going to get rid of. We're going to write poetry that does not induce musical ecstasy or tarab. And one way that we're going to do that is by writing poems in prose. And so they did this in part by translating, as I said, French poems en prose. So by Artaud was a very important poet for Unsi el-Hajj, and preeminently, I would say, Saint-Jean-Perse. And their point was that there is a music to these poems, but it is not a music of the external meter that can be measured on a metronome. It has to do with a kind of welling up of the spiritual self. It's a kind of vague, frankly, notion, but they're definitely saying this kind of meter, which is external, doesn't have to. It can't capture the symphony of modern life. So there was that. I think very important notion of translation at work, that we're translating a whole different kind of music, a whole different kinds of soundscape into the Arab ear.
There's a question from Jonas Al-Busti, who's also one of our Arabic lecturers in the NELC department. He has a twofold question. The first part is, what's the relationship of the modernist movement in Lebanon to the Mahjari poets, mostly in North, but also in South America? And I should add in this case that, Antoun Saada, the founder of the SNNP, of course, had close relationship to those, particularly to the Lebanese migrant community in Brazil and in Argentina, right? And the second question is, could you also speak about the attacks staged against this movement by rivals, for instance, Hussein Murua, and on what grounds? Nationalism, humanism?
Yeah. Well, I'll take them in order. They had a lot to say about the Mahajado movement. So the Mahajado movement, which was as you say, Frank, it was a movement of the early part of the 20th century. It was Lebanese and Syrio-Lebanese intellectuals. There was no Syria in Lebanon at that point. They were part of the same mandate, or same Ottoman province. They established, the Lebanese population is a very diasporic one, and there have been hubs of Lebanese communities up and down the eastern seacoast, and including into South America. So there's what's called a Mahajado Janubi and then also one in the north. So and certainly for the poets that I'm talking about, these modernist poets, this was a very important prior instance of a movement that could be out in the world, that was not just located, it was a non-nationalist literary community. So they very consciously held on to it and pointed to it as precursors. Not only because of its geography, which was far-flung, which pointed towards a certain kind of worldliness, but also because those poets, and in particular Khalil Gibran, this was something that I kind of found hard to understand, because I don't think of Khalil Gibran as a great poet, but actually Adonis in particular does think of him as quite an important great poet. But part of the reason has to do with his formal, his use of prose poetry, actually. Khalil Gibran was very interested, of course, in Whitman. He was interested in a certain kind of American long line, and also biblical parables. But in any case, he was very interesting in formal terms for the modernists, and that was one of the things that, so those two factors, a kind of geographical dispersion, a non-nationalist literary community, and the fact that they had written poems which were formally speaking quite different. Gibran's sources, I would say, his literary sources were quite different from Adonis's literary sources. His had to do with the Bible. It had to do with Walt Whitman. Those were not Adonis's. Adonis's had much more to do with, I would say, contemporary French poetry, like Saint-Jean-Perse, whom he translated at length. The second question, Hossein Maroueh and the antagonists of the Sha'ar movement. They had antagonists throughout the period. They were, for the most part, nationalist and Marxist intellectuals who had a vision of, poets who spoke for a certain kind of political community, which was one that the modernists themselves rejected. So Hossein Maroueh was kind of the dean of Marxist intellectuals. He also ran a magazine. He came from Iraq, but he ran a magazine in Beirut. Several magazines, actually, wrote for them constantly. And one of the things that I talk about, actually, is the ways in which Adonis's revision of the cultural heritage was in many ways kind of, the mirror image of the way that Marxist and nationalist intellectuals did it. So that Maroueh, when he went back to the heritage and he looked at Mutanabbi, for instance, for him, Mutanabbi is a kind of icon of Arabism. Because of the themes that he writes about and because of his poetic persona. But Maroueh also will go back to certain poets and say, well, here is an example of somebody who was speaking up on behalf of the poor. I mean, he'll look at like ascetic like Zuhdi poets and say, he's speaking up for the kind of the common man and for the poetics of poverty or something like that. So there was in some ways, I think, equally interesting. I don't go into it at length in the book, but it was an equally interesting, in some ways compelling way of also reading the classical cultural heritage, but it was done from a Marxist or nationalist point of view.
And that brings up some interesting point as well, because the movement, of course, is an internationalist movement. And when it is confronted with its, you would say, Western interlocutors, then it was adamant in this case to reject any kind of indigenization. Maybe you can speak about that in this case, that it really doesn't want to be typecast, you might see, as the Arabic wing of some internationalist movement.
Yeah, I mean, they were determined to be like modernists, not to be just Arab modernists. Because that, as they understood it, that was the whole point of being an internationalist, was that you didn't have to be, writing what you knew. You didn't have to be just writing kind of local poetry. In fact, this was kind of the bone of contention in the end between the Congress for Cultural Freedom, that is to say, the CIA front group, who wanted to work with intellectuals who had a certain amount of status and street cred in the communities that they came from. And for them, that meant, I mean, to put it in kind of brutal terms, that did mean writing poems with local color that showed that you were Arab, that you had bona fides as an Arab poet. And these modernists didn't do that. They weren't writing about that kind of stuff. They were writing about voyaging on the Mediterranean. And so they did not want to write poems that were full of local color. And that makes them, so actually that makes some of their poetry read very, I would say abstractly. There's a kind of movement towards poetic abstraction in some of their poems, which makes it, that's part of the hermeticism of it, that there's a vocabulary that is very kind of symbolist and allegorical and abstract, and is not drawn from like the details of everyday life in the city. So yeah, they didn't want to be just local poets. They wanted to be poets with they knew there was this audience out in the world, all of a sudden, I would say, in the post-war period, where you could have poems that were kind of published simultaneously in so many different parts of the world. That was a new phenomenon, I think. And they didn't want to be pegged as locals.
Let me bring up one aspect that brings your work in the, I would say, contemporary period. The poet you engage with most in the book is without doubt Adonis. Instead of a conclusion, your book actually has an epilogue where you talk about a controversy where Adonis was involved in 2011, his reaction to the Arab Spring in Syria, the uprising that was so brutally put down by government forces. How is what Adonis said in 2011, how would you see that in the context of what he did in the 50s and 60s?
Yeah, so this was an incredibly disappointing moment for some, especially young Syrians. So what happened basically is that after the revolts broke out in the spring of 2011, Adonis eventually, after some months had passed, came out and said, and several thousand people had died, and said, I can never support a revolution that comes out of the mosques. Of course, it was true in some sense that a lot of the movement did come out of mosques, but his implication was that because this was a sectarian revolution, that this was basically a Sunni revolution. Of course, some did come out of the mosques because they were some of the few open spaces within Syrian cities. I think Adonis was implying a sectarian meaning to the revolts that probably wasn't there yet, frankly. I mean, we're talking about the spring and summer of 2011. Of course, it did become, in large part, a sectarian conflict, but I don't know that it was. I wouldn't have said that it was at the time, but Adonis implied that it already was. And some of his critics said, well, pointed to the fact that, and this is the other episode that I treat in the epilogue, in 1979, when the Iranian Revolution took place, Adonis was one of the intellectuals, many Arab intellectuals of all stripes, leftists of all stripes, supported the Iranian Revolution in its early phases. Adonis supported it for longer than most, and even said that basically he used it as a kind of way to wag his finger at Marxist intellectuals in particular, saying that here is a real revolution. This is a total transformation of Iranian life. And it has not come at the hands of the working class. This is not a proletarian revolution. It's an Islamic revolution. And that shows that there are seeds of revolutionary fervor, particularly in the Shia portion of the Islamic heritage. So he supported the Iran. He later recanted. I mean, he thought that he later acknowledged that this was not that this reading of the revolution was not the correct one, and that he regretted, frankly, his own reading of it. But his critics in 2011 said, well, wait a second. In 1979, you support a revolution that comes out of the mosques, but they come out of Shia mosques. In 2011, you don't support a revolution that comes out of the mosques, that comes out of Sunni mosques. Doesn't this suggest, they say, that really you're not an internationalist, humanist, apolitical, poet, but that really you're a sectarian like other sectarians, that you're a Shia sectarian. And Adonis comes from an Alawite family, which is a branch of the Shia religion. That was the critique that was made of him. And I think it's a perfectly legitimate critique, except that I believe, having kind of begun my study with looking at the kind of way of thinking about the world which is a modernist way of thinking about the world, I came to think that the episode in 1979 was essentially not one that had any kind of carryover. That is not the important episode as far as I'm concerned, in understanding Adonis as an intellectual, as a poet, as somebody who thinks about politics. But that really the deeper story to his life as a poet and an intellectual has to do with a commitment to this separation of culture from politics, and any kind of revolution needing to be really a complete revolution that doesn't have to do with sects or politics, but has to do with kind of the realm of mentalities, that has to be a kind of cultural revolution before it can be anything else. And a deep suspicion of any kind of statist project, like the one that ended up being the case, taking power in Iran. So my argument ultimately in that chapter is that the deeper strand of thinking that Adonis exemplifies actually is a modernist strand, and it has to do with the suspicion of politics in general, that it's like he doesn't think of politics as a possible project of liberation. That's basically what he does not think politics can do. He thinks culture can, but politics can't. And so his response in 2011 was actually in line with what I take to be the deepest impulses of his thought.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Robyn. Let me again remind you of the book, City of Beginnings, Poetic Modernism in Beirut. An extremely well-written study that offers lots of insight and many surprises. And thanks very much, Robyn, for presenting in this book.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you.
And we wish you all a good Thanksgiving. Enjoy the next week at home or wherever you are. Thank you very much.
Thank you.